Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Anne, Joey's sister. I'm pretty sure we always have a story to tell and how we have had our encounter with the Lord. Personally, for myself, it was through life and death. Let's say a seed was planted into me back in 2000. So 19 years later, here I'm standing, and by the grace of God, He has transformed my life. You know, a seed always starts small. You know, when I first came to know Christ, I was basically working at a law firm, and a friend of mine had always come by my reception desk and always said, go to church, go to church. But I was raised and brought up as a Catholic, so I didn't really think there's much difference between a Catholic and a Christian. I'm like, I don't even go to my church. Why would I go to your church? You know, the ignorance. But she was so persistent in, you know, getting me to come to church, and it gave me the impression, like, are you getting paid commission? To, like, you know, why are you so excited to, like, get me to go to church? Like, what's this? Are you getting paid commission, right? So she kept insisting to pray. I want to pray for you, right? So I got to the point where I just got really annoyed. I just, okay, you know what? I'll just pray with you, right? So with that being said, the seed was planted then. And so back in 2004, 4 years after I had a moment with her, I got into a tragic accident. I was struck by a streetcar, literally flew 15 feet, and I was announced dead at the scene of the accident. But then after 8 seconds, based on what the report read, I had life again. They were able to resuscitate me. And so going through the whole process of therapy and treatment and all that, the same lady, when I was in the bed, hospital bed, I remember for some reason, right when I opened up my eyes after the coma, for some reason I thought of her. I don't know why, like you would think 4 years of not keeping in touch with her, not knowing her and seeing her, like she came to mind, right? And I don't remember her number. So I know by the grace of God, that was Him dialing her number, because all I remember was 416-888. That's the easiest number to remember. But the last 4 digits was just like, there's no way I could have remembered. So I dialed it some way, somehow, and she answered the phone. The same lady that planted the seed for me 4 years before was the same lady that came to the rescue, came by my bedside. All those, you know, weeks and months at the hospital, I had to go through rehabilitation to learn how to walk and talk again. Because if you think about it, a streetcar is a quite heavy vehicle, all steels and metals, right? And so now that I look back, you know, God wanted that seed to be planted 4 years, because had I not, you know, had that chance to meet her, even though I was really annoyed and frustrated with her, right? But who would have known that I would have called her in my hospital bed, and she came by my bedside, you know, and just really reached out to me. She took care of me, and right when I got discharged from the rehabilitation, she came every Sunday to bring me to church. And not just that one accident, but I've had a lot of encounters of life and death in my own life, right? And every time I've overcome that death and I come back to life, it's always a confirmation to me how much of God's grace, of His love, you know, and of His mercy, and having me here, standing here. You know, He's been so good to me. He's been so gracious, and, you know, giving me a second chance in life. Because prior to that, truthfully, to be honest with everyone, I was going clubbing every week, you know, doing drugs and stuff like that, because I didn't have a life. My life was just like always, I guess, depressed, you know, didn't get along with my family, with my mom. And then, you know, I just did the same thing every weekend, go clubbing, getting home, all like, you know, high and everything, and then just doing the same routine every week, right? And then when I had that accident, honestly, that was a turning point of my life. It's almost like when I was announced dead, God was like, no. You know, He breathed life into me again 8 seconds after, and then He gave me life. And when I started going to church, I remember, you know, really passionate about going to church. You know, even though I was a newborn, I guess, you know, Christian, I wasn't really as strong as I am today, but just that simple faith of just being like, wow, you know, she's so nice, and she takes care of me, and she's been so good to me, right? I really felt the need to encourage Joe to come. And every, you know, week I would say, go to church, and it took me a long time to really, you know, I guess pursue. And again, the seed that was planted in me, I was able to plant to my brother. And then 10 years later, just 10 years, like a few years ago, he came to know Christ, you know. So once we plant the seed, or someone plants a seed in our life, eventually it will blossom, it will, you know, grow, right? But we just gotta keep planting the seed, right? Just in my own life, you know, my seed was planted back in 2000. So 19 years ago, but I didn't come to know Christ on May 23rd, 2004. So right after I got discharged from the rehabilitation, I went home. I got baptized right away because I was ready to give my life to God, right? So for me, the encounter was life and death, you know. sometimes it takes a tragic moment for some of us to come to really know Christ, right? For me it did, because prior to that I was very stubborn, very ignorant, and I was just like, I don't even go to church. Why would I go to your church, right? So with that being said, that really helped me a lot to realize that God is merciful. He's always, when He puts a seed in our heart through whoever it is, He'll be sure to grow it, right? I've had so much people in my life, friends and family, who have really watered it, but God has really helped me grow. And now, my own brother, it's amazing how now when I'm in tears, he's the one that's coming to me to encourage me and to pray over me, right? So it's been such a blessing to be a part of God's family. There was definitely a lot of highs and lows, ups and downs, but for me, it's just like my life is a walking testimony, a walking miracle of what God has done in my life, because if it wasn't for His second chance and breathing life into me 8 seconds after, I wouldn't be standing here testifying how great our God is, how, real and alive He is and active in my life, and I'm sure in everyone's life too. Sorry, I have some pictures too. That was me in the hospital bed, just barely, I had 50 staples on my head, so they had to leave it there, and a week later they had to take it off. I'm pretty sure all of us, we have a story to tell of how God has done His work in our lives. We've all had planted seeds in our hearts. So may, we all grow in the love of God. And that 2020 coming up, I wish everyone, 2020 vision, seeing God, seeing what He has sown in your heart, and that you will reap everything that He has sown. And whatever you have sown in your own personal life, that you will reap it too. And that 2020 will be a year where you guys will see clearly, God's calling, God's purpose in all of your lives, big or small. He has a purpose for all of us. So I encourage us to always, walk with Him faithfully, through your good and bad days, highs and lows. Just know that He is a God that is alive and active in our lives. So, thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. I hope you guys had a great Christmas. So if it's okay, can we just turn to the people who are around you? Can we just say Merry Christmas to people who are around you? So go around, get to know their name, and just say, hey, Merry Christmas. Get to know them. We're continuing on our series, the Kingdom of God series, and we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount. And what the Sermon on the Mount is where Jesus, He began to share with the people who had gathered what the kingdom life looks like, what it means to be God's people, what it means of this new ushering of humanity that Jesus was ushering in and saying, this is what your life was supposed to be when God first created it. And so as we continue through it, today we land on a portion that talks about adultery and divorce. And I know that this is probably not a common theme that you would use for the end of the year service to talk about adultery and divorce, but I'm going to link it a little bit with some stuff that some of us have been experiencing in this Christmas season, as busy as it was. Last time we talked about the kind of anger or rage that has developed because of the busyness of the season, and I want to connect this in this kind of same way as well. So I'm sure that this Christmas season for some of us has been hectic, and there's a lot of things that we buy, and a lot of times with the Boxing Day sales, and then before Christmas we have our Good Friday sales that are going on. There's always, doesn't there always seem to be that one item that we really want, and that one item that becomes that must-have? And especially for those of us who are parents and we have young children, I'm sure you've experienced this at some place or some year of your life where your children said, this is the must-have toy of the year. And every parent is going crazy trying to get that one toy. And I remember when I was a young boy, my parents At that time, they were preparing for Christmas, and they knew what the must-have toy was for that season. Those of you who are younger, you may not have ever heard of this toy, but when I was growing up in the 80s, this was the toy. It was called the Cabbage Patch Kids. Have you guys ever heard of that? Some of you? So the Cabbage Patch Kids, that's what it was. So you guys are looking at this saying, what's that? The one that I specifically wanted was this one right here. And I looked through every catalog, and back then there was a store called Consumer Distributing, and that store was kind of like the Amazon of today, right? And so I looked through the catalog, found it, and I demanded that my parents, I said, you have to get me that particular Cabbage Patch kid. And so I was driving mad. I was telling my parents, you gotta get it now, you gotta wait in line. They waited in line to try to get it. They were on back order, and they were saying, Eddie, we're not sure if we'll be able to get it on time before Christmas. And I was freaking out inside. My whole life seemed to be dependent on whether or not I had this toy. My whole mindset was so entranced by I felt like my life has no meaning if I don't have this Cabbage Patch doll. And it's so weird. If I look back those many years when I was around 8 or something at that age, when I look back, I can't believe just how addicted I was, how crazy I was about a toy. When I look at it today, I'm like, oh, that looks like nothing. In fact, if you look at the next picture, the story behind the Cabbage Patch Kids is really kind of weird. So these Cabbage Patch Kids, they grew out of cabbage. So the story behind it is this one guy saw this mystical field that had cabbages in it, and inside were these babies that are born, right? And they form their own community. And what they're looking for are people to adopt them, right? So they become their own community, and they live together as they're born out of cabbage. And the whole craze behind Cabbage Patch Kids is collect them all. You don't want any one of them to be left as orphans in their own community. So that was the whole craze behind it. And I was like, we gotta save them, or I gotta have one for myself. And when I look back again, I'm realizing just how silly I was to feel at that time. Why is it that I was so crazy and I really felt like, with the earnest sincerity, I felt like my life would be over or it would be meaningless if I didn't get this toy. Do you know how long that lasted? Less than a year. Less than a year, I had this toy and I realized, I don't know what to do with it. You just carry it around, it doesn't talk, it doesn't do anything, and then you just keep it. But now you can say to your friends, oh, I got the same toy too. But I lost interest in this toy with less than a year. And then the new craze stepped up. But I remember having thoughts like this. I remember in my lustful desire for this toy, that I must have it, I remember going as far as thinking this: if my parents really loved me, like other parents love their children and got them the Cabbage Patch Kids, if my parents really love me, they will make sure that I get this toy. I began to question my parents' love, whether or not they got me that toy or not. When we look at today's passage comes from Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 32. I'm going to read it for us. Today I'll just read the whole thing. It reads this: You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So what does this kind of first illustration of my kind of desire for this toy that I had, that I felt would fully complete me, have to do with this passage that talks about adultery and also divorce? Well, let me present to you two observations that I noticed in this passage. And before these observations, I want to give you this kind of general sense of what lust is. When we talk about lust, yes, in this passage in particular, is talking about lust in terms of when you're in a marriage relationship, that you begin to sexually lust after another person that does not belong to you. In that area, lust, what it represents is this unfettered, uncontrolled emotion that you let loose that can only be satisfied once you get what your emotions desire. In that same way, when we look at lust in a bigger picture, we can lust after many things. It's not just relationships. We can lust after things. We can lust after power. We can lust after a certain career. And we feel like in that moment, as we allow our emotions to take over, we can feel like our life cannot be complete if I don't get that one thing. You know, I found it interesting that in the Sermon on the Mount, it was only when Jesus talked about adultery and murder that he mentions the word hell. Here we see you are in danger of hell if you allow this lust to go unfettered. You are in danger of hell, he says earlier in the chapter, when he says, when you allow your hate that you have for your brother or your sister to go unfettered. He says you are in danger of hell. You know, the first observation that I want to make is, so what is this hell? Why does Jesus mention hell in these two instances? Well, hell, in the Greek word that is used for this particular passage, he uses the word Gehenna. And Gehenna was some people believe that it was referring to this valley called Hinnom or something, where there's a judgment that was cast over and saying you will reap this kind of judgment in the valley of Hinnom. And so they kind of like transferred over to this mindset in the Greek where they called it Gehenna, meaning abyss. This place where you are in this abyss of complete judgment from God. And the abyss, when he talks about henna or when he talks about hell, what this abyss is about is it's about this abyss or this absence of anything that is significant, anything that is good. It's an abyss where there is this absence of what God can provide your life. His love, His hope, relationships. So when Jesus talks about this in this way, where you're in danger of hell or Gehenna, when you are hating your brother or your sister, or when you are already in a covenantal relationship and you're lusting after a different relationship, sacrificing and being willing to break off something that is the most sacred institution that any human can make here on earth, willing to break that for something else that may not last longer than simply what the emotions drive us towards. He says you are in danger of hell, of an abyss. An abyss of what? An abyss of significant relationships. We begin to separate ourselves from every relation. That is why when C.S. Lewis, he talks about hell, he writes a book that's called The Great Divorce. It's a divorce, it's a separation of the most significant thing that all human needs in our life, which is a relationship with God, and through that relationship with God, our relationship with one another. Hell is like an abyss of relationships. When we allow our lust after certain things to become fully formed, it seems to produce a divorce. It produces a separation from the thing that is most important to us. You know, when I began to look at my own lust for this Cabbage Patch Kid, it made me divorce from a thinking that my parents love me. Even if my parents don't give me this gift, even if my parents can't get this gift, my mindset divorced me because my lust started to drive me towards this one thing that I felt like I needed so badly. It made me feel like inside, my parents don't love me if I don't get this. It separated me from that which was the most secure thing that I had in my life. In the same way, when Jesus warns those who are in the most covenantal and most sacred relationship in marriage, he warns people against lust. He says, yes, your lust may be intense. Yes, it might drive you mad because you feel like that will ultimately satisfy you. But what you are doing is you're willing to break yourself off. You're willing to divorce yourself from that which is the most pure and good thing that you have in your life for something that will only last an instant. For me, my desire for Cabbage Patch Kids only lasted less than a year. In the same way, sometimes our lust, it drives us towards this thinking to really believe that if I get this, it will really satisfy my life. I will really be happy. But once we've tasted it and once we've seen it, we've all come to that same conclusion that we are left lusting for something more, for something different. And the more and more we separate ourselves from more and more things, we find ourselves isolating ourselves as we become creatures, not of what is true, but we become creatures that are just overwhelmed by just satisfying our lusts, our emotions. A lot of times we can have this in our relationship with God as well. We feel so certain that in our relationship with God, and God calls us, He says, I love you, and I gave my son for you. I did all of this for you so that you might have life. And then when we look around and we have this most stable and this most significant connection of someone that says to us that you are mine, we have that absolute certainty that no matter what we do, that God gives us that promise that you are mine. I'll watch over you. I know the plans that I have for you. I created you wonderfully and fearfully. I have, and I know the plans and purposes, not to harm you, not to turn you away, but to give you a hope and a future. With that promise that we have, a lot of times we look at the world that's around us and we find our feelings and our desires lusting for something else. We find ourselves lusting for a career. And then we feel that because God's not giving it to us in the timing that we want or in the method that we want, we begin to question His love, the most secure thing that we have for our life. And we believe in something that's not guaranteed. We do the same thing with our human relationships as well. We begin to look around and we begin to lower our standards for what God wants to provide because we have this lust from whatever we're looking for when we compare ourselves with other people and what they have in their relationships, that we feel like I want that too, and I want to equate myself with what other people are having. And because of this, we begin to lust after these things that we forget the most primary and the most life-fulfilling relationship that God has to offer us. When we are separated from the things that really bring us life, what we will find is because we're always chasing after certain lusts, you will find in your heart, you get more and more thirsty. You're never satisfied. Nothing satisfies us. We search after the one thing, we get it, it dries up after a few months. Then we look for the next rage, the next great thing, and we search after that, and it dries up after the next few months. And by the time that 10 years goes by, we notice that our whole life has been all about just seeking after these lusts that temporarily fill us, but ultimately keep us feeling empty. The second point that is here, the observation, is that he talks about and he relates this lust as its fully formed result, its fully formed fruit. He begins to talk about divorce. Jesus reveals that here he says, you have heard it said that anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. He's referring back to Deuteronomy 24, when Moses gave this law because men were abusing the certain relationships and they wanted to look righteous and they didn't want to cheat behind or they didn't want to look bad in society as they are committing adultery. And so they said, what's an easier way for us to do it while maintaining our righteousness or our appearance of righteousness? And Moses, because their hearts were hardened, what he gave them as a concession was, you have to write a certificate of divorce. You got to end that relationship before you pursue another. And Jesus says, you've heard it said that all you need is to get that certificate of divorce. And then that relationship is broken, it's ended, it's finished. Right? Where you have no more responsibility over that and you can pursue something else. And Jesus says, you've heard it said this, but I tell you, Jesus says. In other words, what Jesus is giving, he's saying, that's not what that law was meant for. It wasn't to give you a legal way to go out of your responsibility. Jesus says, I tell you, he says, anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery. In other words, he says, anyone who divorces his wife for sexual immorality, that Greek word that is used there is porneia. Porneia, it covered over anything that was abnormal within the confines of a marriage. If you divorce your wife other than anything that is sexually immoral, and that person, your partner that you have, refuses to be in that kind of relationship with you, he says that pathway to divorce is possible. But before people got this mindset of, great, then I can do it. And if I catch my wife or my husband in the act, finally I'll be able to move on and then I can leave it. But it's not so. Because we are reminded of a model that is given through the prophet Hosea. The kind of, when Jesus is mentioning this kind of only for marital unfaithfulness in that kind of area, he's saying that, but we have gone to the level of doing everything possible to the point where it's become impossible for that person to continually want a relationship with us. It's not absolving us of responsibility. We look at Hosea, and the prophet Hosea, what he did is he showed the example of what God's love is towards us, and the same love that we need to now commit ourselves to one another, and especially in the marriage. He mentions, remember, Gomer. And Hosea telling Hosea, marry Gomer, and Gomer keeps going out every night, prostituting herself to other men who abuse her and who mistreat her and misuse her, all because she's lusting for some of these kind of things. And every night, what Hosea does is that's marital unfaithfulness. That's sexual immorality. I can give a certificate of divorce, but what God calls Hosea to do, he says, go after her, bring her back, reveal what my love is, clean her up, restore her, and love her. And she goes out again, does the same process, brings her back, restores, cleans her up. And in that picture, we see what Jesus means by anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality. He's not just saying you caught them once and it's over, it's done. Saying what love does is love must mean something. Where love is not just a contract that is between us, me and this other person, and we're trying to look for loopholes to get out of a contract so that we can fulfill our lusts or our own agendas. He says love must mean something more than just a verbal promise that can easily be broken. You know, when we make our vows on our wedding day, and we say, I will love you through sickness and in health, through good times and bad times. That kind of covenant that we are making with our spouse, saying, I will love you to that very end, it brings a source of security to our very soul. That we know, yeah, I may not be at my best at times, and I may struggle, but to know that another person will endure through our weaknesses, will endure through our failures. It brings this revelation of what God's kingdom is about, how God loves us. He doesn't call us towards a strict legalistic law and just saying, I want you to do good because you are my people and divorce is bad and you are never permitted to divorce. That's not the reason why God gave us this law. He gave it because he knows how much divorce can ruin our spirit. He knows that if a person that we've said, and the most sacred commitment that a human can make to another, to say, I will love you to your very end of life, and we were certain that that person meant it. What makes us so sure that the next person will give that? It makes us become people that begins to question, am I really loved? Is my life significant? Because that breaks us up to the very core. What God does, and we were reminded through the Christmas story, is God gave his one and only Son. And the grace of the Christmas story isn't that God didn't just have a great beginning, but he showed the extent of his love through the crucifixion. What God does is, when I say I love you to the very end. He didn't just give his Son and present to us a great Christmas. Oh, God with us, and Emmanuel, and it's going to be great. God loves us so much. But even when we were broken, even when we began to curse God, even when we were singing Hosanna at one part, and then the next part, we think that God doesn't exist, and we're saying, yeah, crucify him. We don't care about him anymore. Even then, the kind of love that God has for us is not a love that we say, okay, here's my certificate of divorce and our separation because you have broke your covenant. What we see in God, the Son, he's saying, to the very end, I will give my life. To the very end, even when you act in this kind of way, to let you know that my love never fails for you. You know the kind of security that brings into our spirit? And this is why that relation becomes primary. But the lust that Satan brings to us is to drive us away from the thing that is most securing, most truthful, most foundational in our everyday life. Brothers and sisters, this is why when we see this, it's not just about relationship that Jesus talks about. The importance here is not just a legal rule. Christians have to be good. And Christians have to act in this kind of way just because I said so. It's not just morality that he's talking about. He's talking about the essence of our very soul being ruined. It ruins us. This is why God says he hates divorce. Because in divorce, it's saying, I no longer have any responsibility towards you. You live your life, I live my life. See, this is the same danger that all of us have in life. You know, sometimes as we're living life, it is so hard to trust God. It's so hard to believe that he has a plan for our life. It's so hard to believe why I'm stuck in the rut or the mess or the kind of family life that I'm in. And we struggle a lot through this. And God's not calling us simply, hey, stay in there because I gave you a law and the law says you cannot divorce. That's not where that motive comes from. The motive, it comes from God saying, you can trust my love that I have for you. And out of my love that I have for you and you experiencing it, trust me that I know what I'm doing when I'm inviting you to keep going. Because it restores your soul. You know, when Jesus was talking about his death, he said, if a kernel of wheat does not fall to the ground and dies, it cannot produce more seeds. And there are times when we give up our desire for lust or our desire for other things that we feel like will fulfill us. And we feel like we're slowly dying inside because the situation that we're in is terrible. And we feel like God's not nowhere around. He's not really helping us and he's not blessing us. And because we feel like that, we feel like we're slowly dying. And when referring to his own death, what Jesus was going to produce through his death so that there might be life for the many, in that same way, we can trust him with our life. I know I feel like sometimes that trying to trust God when we're called to love others and remain in that love when it's so difficult and it tears us apart, it feels like we're dying inside. He says, unless that kernel of wheat dies, it cannot produce more seeds. And there is a trust element that is there that makes us wonder, if God really is good and He loves each and every one of us, we know that there is also a pruning aspect that happens. A pruning aspect to our soul, our mindset, our values, that begins to happen in our life that God wants to reveal. He wants some parts of it to die, yes, because it's not good, it's not healthy. But His motive behind that is not so that we totally die, so that we begin to bear the seeds, the fruit that our life is meant to bear. We've heard it said that sin, when it's fully grown, it produces death. Lust, when it's fully grown, it develops into a divorce of relationships, a divorce of your own soul sanity, whatever it may be. This is why Jesus says, don't pursue these lusts. You know, the good news that we have in this promise is what Jesus does to us, where He says, I've come that you might have life and have it to the full. That's His promise. He gave Christ His Son so that through His Son we would experience this life. The number one thing as this year ends and as this new year begins that we must hold on to in our relationship is our relationship with Christ. He will maintain our spirit so that our life is not an endless life of running after certain lusts and finding out that it dies and it dies and it dies and it leaves us empty all the time. Brothers and sisters, this is not the life that God has called us towards. He called us that we might have life and have it to the full. And He gave His Son to guarantee that we have someone loving us, someone giving everything to make our life possible so that any time that we follow after Him, it's not useless. It's not pointless. But it fills us, and we'll see the fruit from it. Let's pray.